Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. I once had a professor argue, and I think compellingly, that the 1950s were the longest decade in American history. Starting somewhere around 1947, it was still the 1950s up through 1963. He also argued that the 60s were the shortest decade, starting in 1964, but by 1968, the anger and resentment turned into the 1970s, really characterizes that time. I think that's a compelling argument, but it's a question of historical sociology, not of chronology. Today we're going to focus on the actual calendar decade of the 1950s. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have 4 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to discuss the significance of the presidential election of 1960. You should be able to identify major events of the civil rights movement of the early 60s. You should be able to explain the major causes and policy initiatives of the Kennedy presidency. And you should be able to examine the purposes and strategies of Johnson's Great Society programs. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 13. Kennedy and Nixon squared off in a presidential campaign of 1960, and it was one of the closest in American history. Richard Nixon was the vice president. He's Eisenhower's vice president, and he was facing off against the Democratic candidate, a senator from Massachusetts known as John F. Kennedy. He was a young senator and a Roman Catholic whose father had been an important U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. Lyndon Johnson was Kennedy's running mate. Johnson and Kennedy, both Democrats, but from opposite ends of the Democratic Party, representing a broad spectrum there. Both Kennedy and Nixon were ardent Cold Warriors. They were opposed to the spread of communism. And they both knew that the United States military and economic capacity of the United States was far greater than the Soviet Union's capacity. But Kennedy's criticisms convinced a lot of people to believe that new leadership was needed. Kennedy argued that the Soviet Union's success in launching Sputnik, the first satellite to orbit the Earth, and their tests of the first intercontinental ballistic missile showed that the United States and the Republicans had let a missile gap develop and was lagging behind the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Subpoint B, Americans were worried, though, that having a Roman Catholic in the White House would lead to either influence of the Pope on American policies or to closer ties between the church and the state. Anti-Catholic prejudice was still very much in the mainstream of society in 1960. Kennedy tried to allay those worries by discussing the issue openly and delivered a speech in 1960 to Protestant clergy to that effect. In the secular and Protestant press, his speech was hailed as a triumph for Kennedy, that he would be an independent president and would not blindly follow the commands of a pope. In recent years, Catholic writers have noted that the Houston speech also gave license to Catholics to make their faith into a private subject that doesn't shape the rest of their identity. Subpoint C. Kennedy had a well-organized campaign and the backing of his wealthy family. He was handsome and charismatic, yet many felt that at 43, he was too inexperienced to be president. If elected, he would be the second youngest president in American history and the youngest to be elected. Who was the youngest in American history? One event in the fall determined the course of the election, when Kennedy and Nixon took part in the first televised debate between presidential candidates. In September 26th, 70 million viewers watched the 2 articulate and knowledgeable candidates debating issues. Nixon was a real expert on foreign policy, and he had agreed to the forum in hopes of exposing Kennedy's inexperience. However, Kennedy had been coached by television producers, and he looked and spoke better than Nixon. Kennedy's success in the debate launched the television age of American politics. People who listened to the debate on the radio all thought that Nixon was the far superior debater. But the ones that watched it on television had almost entirely the opposite reaction. Kennedy was so good on television, it didn't matter if what he was saying was fluff or, just not even holding up. The man was born for the medium. Subpoint D. Election in 1960 was the closest since 1884, and Kennedy won by fewer than 119,000 votes nationwide. And his inauguration set the tone for a new era at the White House, one of grace and elegance and wit. It was a sharp contrast from the modest Midwestern years of Truman and Eisenhower. The Kennedys put their popularity and connections to work in the view of the American audiences. Over 100 writers and artists and scientists were invited to his inauguration. Kennedy called for hope and commitment and sacrifice, inspiring a generation with his, eternal phrase that, "So, my fellow Americans, I ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Roman numeral number 14. The Ella Baker helped found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to change the culture in respect to civil rights. It was a young person and student-focused organization which would go try to affect real social change. Sit-ins and wade-ins for public beaches often got black protesters arrested, but it was part of the movement. And while rare, some protesters actually ended up getting so far as getting killed in the ensuing violence. The Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, remember both of these acronyms, by the way, acronyms. SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, have the same goal. They have different kind of audiences that they're working into, but they're both civil rights organizations. So the Congress of Racial Equality organized the Freedom Rides in 1961. Groups of integrated black and white protesters traveled by bus into the Deep South to go test anti-discrimination protections on interstate buses and trains. In Alabama, a bus station was firebombed by counter-protesters there to go break up the Freedom Ride. A violent Klan mob in Birmingham, Alabama attacked the Freedom Riders with bats and chains, while police officers often just refused to intervene. One tactic of the protesters was to get arrested in large groups. That may be a surprise to the tactic of the protest is to get arrested, but to get arrested in large groups would then go fill the jails and gain the attention of the media. Why did these people want to protest? Subpoint B. Here I want to go and talk about the integration of universities, and in particular, the most notable was that of Ole Miss, University of Mississippi. And I want to introduce you to James Meredith, a United States Air Force veteran who served in the Air Force from 1951 to 1960. He'd been stationed in Kansas, my favorite state at that time. Now, Meredith was a black man, and he took classes at the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk, and at Washburn University. Go Ichabods? In 1961, Meredith applied to the University of Mississippi, but was denied because of his race. By this point, he was no longer in the Air Force, but it was going on and trying to claim GI Bill to go take the benefits of serving. And the United States Court of Appeals ordered Ole Miss to admit Meredith, but he faced opposition from the governor. Meredith tried to register for classes in 1962, but when he walked up to the registration building, he found that the entrance was blocked and couldn't get inside. The U.S. State Police just stood aside while violent race riots erupted. U.S. Attorney U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy sent in 500 federal marshals to the scene. And JFK, his brother the president, sent in the military police and National Guard troops and the United States Border Patrol, all to keep peace there at Ole Miss. On October 1st of 1962, James Meredith became the first black student to enroll at University of Mississippi, and in 1963 he graduated with a political science degree from the university. Subpoint C. Let's turn our eyes to Birmingham, because the high point of the protest came in 1963 when Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, you'll see it abbreviated later, had been trying to raise national attention for its protests in the South. While the rest of the country was interested in discrimination in the South, it wasn't largely motivated to do anything about it. It was an idle concern. Martin Luther King Jr. led a demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama, which used nonviolent but intentionally confrontational tactics. And I want you to remember that that's a difference. King's movement is a nonviolent movement, but it's not a peaceful movement. It's there to provoke confrontation. The SCLC used children and adults in its protest, a controversial move that Newsweek called the Children's Crusade. Police Chief Eugene Bull Connor used high-pressure water jets and police dogs against protesters, including children. It was broadcast on national television news, shocking many white Americans and consolidating black Americans behind the movement being led by King. This was actually the goal. King knew that news coverage of abuse would bring the needed attention, and Birmingham's violence forced white Americans to decide whether they had more in common with citizens demanding rights or with violent segregationists. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and served a 9-day prison sentence for the protest. And there he wrote, I think, the most important document on civil rights in America's history, the letter from a Birmingham jail. King argued that the crisis of racism is too urgent and the system was currently too entrenched. He writes, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. He defended illegal protests, pointing out that the Boston Tea Party was a celebrated act of rebellion in the American colonies, but it was illegal civil disobedience. And that conversely, just obeying the law wouldn't matter because everything that, say, Adolf Hitler did in Germany was totally legal. In June of 1963, a sniper shot an NAACP field secretary. In September of that same year, a bomb exploded at a Black Baptist church, killing 4 young girls. Subpoint D. This prompts the March on Washington on August 28th of 1963. The March on Washington was organized by a coalition of civil rights, labor, and church organizations. It brought 250,000 black and white protesters, the largest demonstration in American history to that point. Using a slogan of jobs and freedom, the march called for civil rights legislation, a public works program to go reduce unemployment, and increasing the minimum wage. This agenda found common ground with white liberal groups, reflecting an unprecedented amount of black and white cooperation in support of racial and economic justice. On the steps of Lincoln Memorial, MLK delivered his most famous speech, declaring, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Roman numeral number 15. So Kennedy wins election in 1960 and goes on to the Kennedy years, often remembered in American history as an era of Camelot, like the mythical court of King Arthur. And JFK planned a number of new initiatives to go counter communist influence in the world. The Peace Corps sent young Americans abroad to aid the economic and educational progress of developing countries, and also to go improve the image of Americans there. By 1966, more than 15,000 young men and women were serving as Peace Corps volunteers. The Corps wasn't well received everywhere, though. Volunteers were often suspected of being spies, and the Corps was accused of neo-colonialism and cultural imperialism. JFK also had another program known as the Alliance for Progress, which was not focused worldwide. It was specifically what he called a Marshall Plan for Latin America to go promote material and political freedom. Its goal was to alleviate poverty and to head off calls for communism by sending money and food into that region in Latin America. It didn't work very well. Oftentimes local militaries and elites would go intercept the aid for themselves, and then the poor received very little or no help at all. But to take the lead in the space race, here Kennedy actually probably could get some real feet under him. JFK announced for plans to go to the moon and back, which was a seemingly impossible feat. And indeed, in the 1960s, when he makes this call, it is impossible. The technology just doesn't exist. Kennedy failed at ousting Castro from power in Cuba. Cuban President Bautista had often received American support for years, while Fidel Castro had ousted Bautista in 1959, and then Castro nationalized industries and allied Cuba with the Soviet Union. The CIA trained anti-Castro exiles for an invasion of Cuba, sending 1,400 troops into Cuba's Bay of Pigs. The United States believed they could spark a popular uprising and then go topple Castro, but the attempt failed. 100 people were killed and 1,100 were captured. The CIA instead turned their eyes towards assassination attempts, figuring they could just get rid of Castro that way instead, ranging from poisoned ballpoint pens to exploding cigars. A lot of them are kind of cartoonish. Subpoint B. In 1962, United States spy planes found that the Soviet Union was installing missiles in Cuba capable of reaching the United States with nuclear weapons. Khrushchev believed that President Kennedy was weak and that he could go make this move and that Kennedy wouldn't react to it. But against the advice of the military, JFK blockaded Cuba on October 22, 1962. This means that both sides began to prepare for nuclear war. Khrushchev capitulated 6 days later, and the missiles were dismantled and not installed. In return, Kennedy silently also disbanded our own missile sites in Turkey, which were pointed at the Soviet Union. In 1963, JFK tried to reduce this Cold War tension with a test ban treaty, stopping any future tests of nuclear weapons, which would go advance that industry. Subpoint C. Now, Kennedy was far more interested in Cold War policies than civil rights policies, or really domestic policies in general, and was for a long time largely unconcerned with the civil rights movement. That would change kind of when the situation compelled him to take a broader stance, but he really dragged his feet for a long time on it. he suspecting that the civil rights movement was actually just a communist project, Attorney General Robert Kennedy approved wiretaps for Martin Luther King Jr. and basically put him under FBI surveillance. JFK used federal power in high-profile situations like the University of Mississippi, but otherwise refused to protect civil rights workers from violence. He insisted that law enforcement was a local matter and not the kind of thing you bring in federal officials for. The events at Birmingham in 1963, though, forced Kennedy to take more action, publicly calling for a law banning discrimination in public accommodations, which was a major goal of the civil rights movement. Subpoint D. Kennedy was shot on November 22, 1963 in Dallas, Texas, in an assassination that shocked the country. It was the first assassination to be covered on television. When you go back and see film of the Kennedy assassination, you're not seeing like live TV footage of it. That was like somebody was just recording the parade. It was like a home video. But to be covered in news on television, which was the emerging technology of the way Americans learned about their world. The act was immediately shrouded in controversy, mostly because the assassin himself, Lee Harvey Oswald, was also assassinated 2 days later while in police custody. President Johnson was immediately sworn into office when Kennedy died on the plane flight back to Washington, D.C. Johnson's swearing in was a rushed affair owing to the panic of the movement. Johnson ordered a special commission called the Warren Commission to go investigate the assassination, and it concluded that Oswald acted alone, as did Jack Ruby, the man who assassinated Oswald. Roman numeral number 16. Now that Johnson is president, the office of the White House, like the Oval Office, takes a little bit of a different approach towards civil rights and economic issues. But we got to introduce ourselves to President Johnson, and he emerges onto the stage in 1948 when running for the United States Senate. In 1948, Lyndon Johnson ran for the U.S. Senate, facing two primary opponents, including a popular former Texas governor. The election in 1948 was a close election for Senate, but a precinct in South Texas turned in their ballot box late, which was curious, but okay, we want to hear what the voters are going to say. And there was 202 ballots belonging to voters who voted, curiously, in alphabetical order. And again, curiously, all wrote in the same pen. This was a really strange election. And they all had the same handwriting. Boy, those West Texas towns are kind of a surprise. Johnson won that primary election with 87 votes out of 988,295 votes cast, earning him the nickname Landslide Lyndon. LBJ, Landslide Lyndon, was a master politician and eventually worked his way through the United States Senate to become the majority leader. He became famous for the Johnson treatment, a dizzying way that LBJ would go persuade senators to support his bills. In the 1960 election, he played a key role in winning southern states whose voters could not relate to the rich privilege of Kennedy. Johnson grew up in poverty, and he connected well with poor voters. Subpoint B. Immediately after becoming president, LBJ identified himself with the black movement more passionately than any other previous president. He called on Congress to go pass the Civil Rights Act in honor of Kennedy. In 1964, Civil Rights Act prohibited racial discrimination in employment, in institutions like hotels and schools, and in privately owned public accommodations such as restaurants and hotels and theaters. It also prohibited discrimination on sex, but gave little indication on what that might mean. Though Southerners had been voting Democratic since Franklin Roosevelt, Johnson quipped that the act would aggravate racial tensions in the South. Upon signing the bill, he remarked, "I think we've delivered the South to the Republican Party." Subpoint C. The 1964 Civil Rights Act did not address a major concern of the civil rights movement, the right to vote in the South. That summer, several civil rights groups launched a voter registration drive in Mississippi, and hundreds of white college students traveled to Mississippi for help. Calling it the Freedom Summer, the effort often met local resistance. 35 bombings and many beatings of civil rights workers resulted. 2 white students and a local black boy were kidnapped and murdered by a group headed by a deputy sheriff. The Freedom Summer led directly to the campaign of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, an African-American coalition to get delegates on the all-white Mississippi delegation. At the Credentials Committee hearings, former sharecropper Fannie Lou Hamer gave gripping testimony of police violence. LBJ was afraid that the televised testimony would derail the Democratic Party in the '64 elections, so he called an impromptu press conference to divert attention. Subpoint D. The Republicans in 1964 nominated Barry Goldwater, a libertarian conservative. Barry Goldwater had written a book known as The Conscience of a Conservative in 1960, in which he argued for a more aggressive Cold War, even if it risked a nuclear attack. But most of the book was about domestic policy, discussing topics like education and labor unions and policies and civil rights and agricultural policy and farm subsidies and social welfare programs and income taxation. But in the campaign, Goldwater had threatened to bomb North Vietnam and advocating intervention, whereas Lyndon Johnson promised that he would not send troops to Vietnam. The Johnson campaign portrayed Goldwater as pro-nuclear war and anti-civil rights, and Johnson easily won the 1964 election. Subpoint E. Now, the 60s are usually remembered as a decade of liberal rebellion against the 50s conservatism, but conservatives were pretty active in the 1960s too. Conservative students quickly formed a group called Young Americans for Freedom and became a force in politics. Publisher William F. Buckley hosted the group at his estate in Sharon, Connecticut, and there they wrote the Sharon Statement, which meant to give a unified understanding of conservatism. The Sharon Statement defined the conservative position for the next several decades as their appeals to law and order, appeals against welfare, and a freedom of association often carried some racial baggage to it. Subpoint F. In January of 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. launched a voting rights campaign in Selma, Alabama, where only 355 of the 15,000 black citizens had actually been allowed to register to vote. Against orders from the governor, Martin Luther King led the group from a march in Selma to Montgomery, the state capital. When marchers reached the bridge out of the city, state police assaulted those marchers. Troopers shoved the demonstrators, knocking many to the ground and beating them with nightsticks. Troopers fired tear gas, and mounted troopers charged the crowd on horseback. 17 marchers were hospitalized and 50 others were injured. It was all caught on television, and televised images of the brutal attack presented horrifying images. The marchers left bloodied and severely injured, rousing support for the Selma voting rights campaign. Federal government took action where there was violence against nonviolent protesters, and Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to stop literacy tests and to allow federal officials to go enroll voters if the locals couldn't do it themselves. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution would also go as far as outlawing poll taxes, which would lift a major restriction in Southern voting. Subpoint G. President Johnson also outlined the most sweeping proposal for government action to promote the general welfare since the New Deal. He called it the Great Society and got Congress to pass 206 bills and a flurry of legislation, like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, a large-scale program to fund schools. It hoped to ensure equal access to education and give high standards for education. Or Medicare and Medicaid. They were created to provide funding for health care costs for elderly and for welfare recipients. There was also various other welfare programs to provide food stamps to the poor and expand the terms of disability and elderly care, and a number of public housing projects, especially in urban areas. But unlike the New Deal, the Great Society was a response to prosperity, not to depression. Subpoint H. The centerpiece of the Great Society was Johnson's crusade to end poverty, which he called the War on Poverty. Social science evidence had showed that while the United States was experiencing economic growth overall, certain pockets of the economy were suffering pretty badly, particularly in farm and inner cities that were hidden from suburban and middle-class life. Modern farming was producing more food faster, but at the cost of farm labor jobs. Mechanized industry was producing more goods more cheaply, lowering the cost of living for most Americans, but at the cost of unskilled laborers. The Johnson administration claimed that poverty was caused by really an absence of skills and a lack of proper attitudes and work habits, so it focused on equipping the poor with skills and rebuilding their spirits and motivation. Coinciding with the decade's high rate of economic growth, poverty dropped from 22% to 13% of U.S. families in the 1960s, which is real growth. There's lots of arguments over whether Johnson's war on poverty was long-term successful or short-term successful, and like most things in economics, it's complicated and there's not a straightforward answer. But seeking the answer, improving our more perfect union, is a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you more about. Make sure you like and subscribe. Smash that bell. God bless you.